everyone. With everything going so crazy, it's amazing that people can still show goodwill or kindness. Even in this crazy stage, kindness is always a good thing. It's a way of repaying. When you show a single act of kindness, that kindness is paid 10,000-fold. May take a year, may take 2 years, may even take the last ounce of life. I'm going to tell you the story of a little boy whose act of kindness helped him survive. And when I say survive, he had a lot of challenges to deal with. Once upon a time, there was 2 brothers called Henry and John. Henry was always moaning. He was groaning, he was complaining, he had everything he'd ever wanted. Gentle John, on the other hand, always showed kindness and grace in every way they could. It was understandable their 2 different behaviours. You see, John and Henry's father was very poor. He was a carpenter. He went around trying to offer his service to people. But it was very difficult in those days. There was very little money to go around. No one truly knew the reason why. Henry and John acted very differently in this act of times. Then one day the father happened to stop by the pub. He didn't have enough money for a drink. He just wanted to rest his poor sore legs after a long travel around the town. As he sat down to rest, he overheard 2 palace guards that happened to be having a drink in the tavern. Tavern is another word for a pub, by the way. The 2 men were talking about an incident that had happened about 4 years ago at the palace. You see, about 4 years ago, the king's only daughter, Princess Esmeralda, had been stolen by a sorcerer. The sorcerer had originally asked for a ransom, but the kingdom didn't have that kind of money. And the sorcerer was only interested in one small other thing. You see, he'd taken the king's daughter because the king had betrayed him. Instead of showing gracious and loyalty when the sorceress had helped with the famine, the king had banished the sorcerer away. So the sorcerer came up with a way of testing, the way of a sort of compliment to the ransom. He told the king that whosoever completes my 3 difficult tasks shall rescue the princess. However, if such a man fails to complete the tasks, then there will be an ultimate price to pay. The king had sent over 40 knights to complete these impossible tasks, but so far none of the 40 had returned, and the 2 that were currently in the tavern, well, they were getting nervous. They were one of the last few knights in the kingdom, and they weren't particularly fond of setting their own lives after 40 had disappeared. The king himself had become desperate, and upon realizing his knights weren't willing, had decided to offer the reward out, a huge reward for anyone who can rescue his princess. Well, naturally, Henry and John's father realized there was a good opportunity here. He was very poor and knew that Henry would be very strong. Out of the 2 brothers, Henry was the strongest, you see, and the father was adamant that Henry would be able to complete the impossible tasks. Of course, Henry, being Henry, only moaned and groaned about the poorness of them, and that he would not have such a good reputation if he arrived at the sorcerer's castle in just himself, without a horse or a sword. I think he was believing too much that if he was a knight, he would be able to succeed. The father had a long think. He did have some savings left, which he was hoping to save for a rainy day. Since he believed in his son Henry, he decided to spend those savings on a horse and a sword. Once that was completed, Henry set off for the castle. Along the journey, Henry was as ruthless as he was when he was in the kingdom. He rode past a hive of bees, chopping down the bee's nest. As he crossed over the sand, he trampled and destroyed an ant colony's new home. And as he headed off towards the river, he unfortunately was responsible for at least 6 dead ducks, 2 of which he'd slain himself. It was a terrible thing to do, but Henry just stuck his nose in the air and carried on. Within a day, he'd arrived at the castle. He was not greeted by the sorcerer, but by a young maiden. This was the king's shipman. Sorry guys, I'm very nervous. This was the housekeeper. "Come on in," said the housekeeper. "Please, you must be tired after your long journey. Please take a rest, and we will begin the tasks tomorrow." As well as being very rude, Henry was also very impatient. He didn't sleep a wink that night. He was just so annoyed with the fact that he was going to have to wait and wait and wait and wait and wait for something that he believed he could do within a second. At last dawn came, and the maiden led Henry outside. Henry looked around. There was no challenger, no sign of a contest. "What's going on?" he asked the maid. The maid had a bucket of sand in her hand. As Henry watched, she scattered the sand around a perimeter of a very small circle around Henry, and then placed the bucket by his feet. "Your first task," she explained, "is to put every single grain of sand into the bucket. My master is very kind, and he has decided to offer you 1 hour to complete this task. I wish you luck." And the maiden wandered off to go and do some washing up nearby. Henry stared at the task in absolute annoyance. How dare they declare such a ridiculous task? The sand had sunk in between the grass, and he just looked at it and thought, what? Seriously? When are these tasks going to really happen? This is ridiculous. Not surprisingly, when the hour was up, Henry hadn't even bothered to begin the task. The maiden looked around, tutted, and sighed. "My master has decreed you to follow on with the second task." She led Henry to the edge of a cliff close to where the castle was. From her pocket she produced 7 keys and dropped them into the water. "Your next task is to retrieve the keys from this moat. You have exactly 1 hour to complete this task, and I do hope this time you even try it." Not surprisingly, Henry was not impressed. I'm getting sick and tired of these ridiculous tasks," he said. "Tell your master that he better have the real tasks ready for me by the time the hour is up. I refused your task." The handmaiden just raised an eyebrow and went off to do some cooking. As the hour struck, Henry sat down on the cliff edge. He hadn't bothered. He was too busy looking at the water and grumbling. The handmaiden tutted and shook her head, but in all honesty, there was nothing she could do about it. She gazed up at the sky, as if listening to something, before sighing and said, "My master has decreed that although you have not completed the first and second task, he is willing to give you another chance. Come on upstairs, and we will proceed with the final task." Up a long flight of stairs to the tallest tower, the maiden led Henry. Henry was still grumbling and moaning of the fact these two supposing tasks he'd never had the opportunity to do. When he arrived at the top, he was in a small room. At the end of the room were 3 statues, all covered up in a blanket. There wasn't anything special about these statues. They were just covered in a blanket. The maiden looked up at the sky again, then turned to Henry. "Your next task," she explained, "is to identify the princess out of these 3 statues." Before the maiden had finished her sentence, Henry had had enough. "Look here," he said. "Look here, you wretch. I am not going to stand for this anymore. I suspect that you are going to tell me that your master has said that I will have 1 hour to decide which one of these statues is the princess. Well, I am not going to waste anyone else's time, as a sorceress can't be asked to accept my time. I will make the decision right now. I will pick the one on the left." As soon as Henry had said these words, the statue on the left removed its blanket. But underneath it was not the princess. Underneath it was a huge, ginormous dragon. And it was angry. The dragon roared loudly as the sorceress appeared behind its left wing. Henry was frightened. He'd realised what he'd done. "Please," he said, "please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to, honest. I'm sorry I made a mess of the task. Please, what do you plan to do?" The sorceress, however, had no mercy for a man who could not show kindness. He declared that the dragon take Henry to the abandoned island and remain there for the rest of his life. And Henry was never seen again. As far as I know, he's still on that island. Days turned to weeks, and the father began to lose hope. His savings were starting to dwindle, and he wasn't making very little sale. He was making very little sales. He was also quite frail. When Henry hadn't returned home for at least 2 weeks, the father decided that he would go to the castle to plead for his son's life. John, however, could see that his father would not even be able to make the journey. So, without a horse and a sword, he set off in search for his brother. He took the exact same path as his brother Henry had. It was pretty obvious the hoof marks were still there after all this time. As he carried on, he passed a beehive. The bees were angrily buzzing around their hive, desperately trying to repair what little of their hive was left. John let out a deep sigh, smiled happily, and reached into the forest. He came back to the bees with a collection of wild flowers, each filled with many different types of pollen. "I hope these will help you," he said kindly. He placed the flowers carefully next to the hive. He was about to turn when one of the bees buzzed close to his ear, but it didn't attack him. It buzzed kindly. Thank you, great one. I appreciate and thank you for the flowers. I hope to reward you one day." And he buzzed off to join his friends. John let out a sweet, kind smile and carried on his journey. He wandered for a while. He wandered for a while until he came to an anthill. The ant colony was busy repairing their once brand new home that had been destroyed by Henry less than 2 weeks ago. John decided that he would stay a while and help. He dug into the earth and found fresh soil and sand for the ants to create their new colony. He also gathered a group of leaves and twigs and left them nearby the ant colony in the hope that they could provide food for a while. One of the ants crawled up his arm with gratitude. "Thank you, kind sir," he said. "One day I hope we can reward you." John smiled. "You're very welcome," he said, and let the ant climb down to join his friends and carried on their journey. After a while, he arrived at a riverbank. He was a little tired after his long journey, so he settled down. His father had, with what little kindness was left, with what little gratitude was left, given John a loaf of bread in order for him to have some lunch. As he sat there, munching on his bread sparingly, a group of 7 ducks, what was left of the flock of ducks that Henry had disturbed and destroyed, came over to John warily. John smiled, tore off a piece of the bread, broke it up into little pieces, and gave them to the ducks. Now, ducks don't speak that much, but one duck craned up his neck, gave a knowing wink, and wandered back and honked to his mates. They wandered back to the river to give John some peace. John just nodded happily and continued on his way. By sundown, he'd arrived at the castle, exhausted, tired, but happy. The gentle maiden answered the door, as she'd answered many, many before. "Good evening," said John politely. "I have come to complete the tasks of the kingdom and to plead for my brother's life." The maiden cocked an eyebrow at the saying of the brother, but smiled, accepting his politeness. "Good evening, young sir," she said. "Many people have come to challenge the tasks of my master. You must be very tired, though. Come, you must rest. The tasks will begin tomorrow." Unlike Henry, John had a wonderful night's sleep. He was exhausted from his journey. He settled down into his pillow and dove into a deep, dark sleep. When he woke up the next morning to the gentle touch of the handmaiden, he felt refreshed and ready to take on the tasks. That was until the maiden told him what the task was. Like Henry, John was taken into the field where the sand had already been spread out, and was told that he had to put every single grain of sand into the bucket. Now John could tell that there was no way that he could put every single grain of sand into the bucket, but John knew that if he returned home, his father would not last. He had to do it for his family. He had to do it, and he had to do it to save his father. When the handmaiden had left to go and do a washing, he crouched down onto the sand and tried to scoop up as much of the sand to put it into the basket. But 1 hour was clearly not going to be enough to put every single grain of sand into the bucket. Slowly he began to lose hope. Then he felt something tickle his ankle. He turned round and laughed. Balanced on his ankle was one of the ants from the ant colony that he'd helped earlier, and close behind that ant was all the other of his friends. The ant colony waved its antennae at John, and then waved an antennae at his mates. With quick movements, All the ants gathered together every single grain of sand and put them skillfully into the bucket. John was so grateful he put his hand down so his new friend could climb on the back of his hand. "Thank you," he said. "How can I ever repay you for doing this?"
"I told you," said the ant. "You were so kind to us. We wanted to reward you and say thank you."
John smiled, let his new friend down, and the ants disappeared. Every single grain of sand was now inside the bucket, and he still had 15 minutes to go. John spent that time making a daisy chain. When the maiden came back, John presented the bucket of sand. The maiden was impressed. "No one has ever been able to complete these tasks," said the maiden. I wanted to help you." "Well, it wasn't hard, at least." He gingerly handed over the daisy chain, almost shyly. The maiden looked up at the sky and accepted the daisy chain. "Come with me," she said. "My master has ordered you to come to complete your second task." She led John to the edge of the cliff and once more threw the 7 keys into the river. "Your next task," she explained, "is to collect all 7 keys from the river. You have 1 hour. My master is impressed so far. Do not fail him." And she wandered off. Now, whereas the first task made John feel uneasy, this second one made him nervous. You see, John had never learned how to swim, but he knew he had to try for his family. He dove into the moat, but it was so cold, and his skills as a swimmer was never going to be able to let him complete the task. He managed to crawl himself back onto the bank and back up to the cliff. "What am I going to do now? How will I complete this task?" he thought. He stared down at the moat at the river in despair. He looked to his left. A swan rested its neck very happily against John's shoulder. It quacked happily into John's ear. Then it and 6 of its mates dived into the river with the elegance of a beautiful ballerina. Within seconds, they arrived once again, each with a key in its beak. John was so grateful as they dropped the keys at his lap. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for bringing back the keys," said the duck. And then he and his mates swam off. Like I said, ducks don't speak that well. But one was willing to show John why. As John turned round to put the keys onto a little rope that he'd managed to take off his belt, one of the ducks waddled towards him and dropped a single piece of bread in his hand before waddling off. John smiled happily and popped the bread into his mouth. When the hour struck, the maiden returned and was impressed, both with the key and the little rope that John had made out of his old belt. "I'm impressed," she said. Then she looked up at the sky. "My master is also impressed. But he has ordered that you must complete the 3rd task in order to win. It wouldn't be fair on the others. Come with me." She led John up to the top of the tower, into the room where the 3 statues were. Now, whether it was the fact that John had already completed the tasks or the sorcerer was suspicious is still unknown to this day. But for whatever reason, unlike Henry, the sorcerer presented himself into the room. "Choose one of the statues, my son," he said. "Which one holds the princess?" And he kept a stern eye on John. John looked at the three statues. They were all three of them were exactly the same. "How can I choose which statue is the princess? They all look so similar." Bzzz. He looked up. Over the head of the middle one, a small swarm of bees was buzzing around the head. As John continued to listen, the bees began to speak. "This one, choose this one," the bees all said. He recognized his old friend from the hive. John smiled happily, mouthed a silent thank you to the bees, and pointed an uneasy finger, but confident one, towards the middle statue. The sorcerer folded his arms, looked at John, smiled, and clicked his finger. The two sheets that covered the right and left statue fell to the floor to reveal two giant dragons. The two dragons looked more like pets than ferocious, horrible ones. As John began to relax, the sheet fell from the third one to reveal a beautiful young woman with a beautiful golden crown on her head. It was, of course, the princess. As the princess ran to her new hero, the maiden tapped John on the shoulder and congratulated him for completing all of the tasks before she, the sorceress, and the two dragons disappeared from sight forever, to never appear at the kingdom again. John and the princess returned home on, ironically, Henry's horse, which had been saddled and waiting outside the gate for both of them. The father was brought into the palace to work as the royal footsman, and the king was so grateful that he gave his daughter's hand in marriage to John. But John, as a gentleman, treated the princess as a princess always is and should, because throughout all of it, John was always a kind and gentle soul. I hope and wish that you all have goodness in this world. In this tough time, kindness and graciousness is going to be pretty hard, but we have to keep trying for everyone. It might be the only thing we can do. I'm going to love you and leave you now. Please join me for the next story tomorrow. But until then, sleep tight, my friends.